of Leviticus the same way again. All right. Maybe you've been in a church where pastors taken on the book of Leviticus verse by verse. Wouldn't that be something? Ooh, that'd be a challenge. I taught a class on Deuteronomy verse by verse once, and every verse we talked about, every jot and tittle, and even those oftentimes overlooked passages, hard to deal with. We talked about it, and it was in the same kind of spirit that you're hearing from me today. Deuteronomy and Leviticus. There's some overlap in the coverage with regards to the instruction that Israel receives. So you'll see some same things repeated, and rightly so. This is generation 1 that's hearing this, pre-wilderness experience. And then another generation emerges after the 40 years that gets to hear it again from Moses on the plains of Moab. So that's why we have the repetition in the Pentateuch on a lot of these things. But it's interesting. The foundation has been laid in Leviticus. It's picked up again by Moses, 40 some years later for a different generation. So now we have the Feast of Tabernacles. Let's have, let's see, who did I have read last? Keep reading there, verse 33 through 44. The Feast of Tabernacle.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, On the 15th day of the 7th month, and for 7 days is the Feast of Booths.
Same thing.
To the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any ordinary work. These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as times of holy convocation, for presenting to the Lord food offerings, burnt offerings, and grain offerings, sacrifices and drink offerings, each on its proper day. Besides the Lord's Sabbath, and besides your gifts, and besides all your vow offerings, and besides all your free will offerings, which you give to the Lord. On the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the produce of the land, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a solemn rest, and on the 8th day shall be a solemn rest. And you shall take on the first day the fruit of splendid trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It is a statute forever. Throughout your generations you shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Thus Moses declared to the people of Israel the appointed feasts of the Lord.
I like this one. This is my favorite of the convocations. It's the combination of getting people together in the community and the remembrance of the past as a way of looking ahead to the future and celebrating the goodness of God and all the difference, the focus on the food and the celebration that's involved in getting together and having community and eating together, breaking bread together. And if we look at Deuteronomy, Moses rehashes this same convocation in Deuteronomy 16. And I wanted to bring in a little bit of how Moses expands what he does in teaching on this. And in chapter 16, he's talking about the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. It's the same thing. Verse 13. You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths 7 days after you have gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat, and you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, and your male and female servants, and the Levite, and the stranger, and the orphan, and the widow who are in your towns. 7 days you shall celebrate a feast to the Lord your God in the place which the Lord your God chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and all the work of your hands, so that you shall be altogether joyful. Now you have an excuse to be joyful, right? Which is really interesting and really The whole purpose of getting together is the joy that extends from the recognition of the goodness of God in providing and making His provision. And it includes not only the people upstairs, but the people downstairs. That's a Downton Abbey reference to those of you who weren't listening. Downton Abbey, you know, the maids and servants downstairs were invited to the feast upstairs. Am I the only one that watches Downton Abbey? Man, that's crazy. You guys who are not married out there, let me give you a little charge. It may be true that someday that your beautiful future perfect wife is going to love to watch those kinds of shows like Downton Abbey or Pride and Prejudice and all of its various versions, the BBC version, even the Indian version, the Bride and Prejudice or whatever it's called. Yeah, and those are excellent date night opportunities for you. So you need to be the kind of man, even if you have a beard, is you're going to sit down and watch those shows with your wife, because that's going to be a ministry to her and a wonderful blessing to her. Because last night, guess what I had to watch? Poldark and Indian Summers, all on the same night. And it's all that BBC, PBS stuff that they're really getting into these days. They bring in these shows. But we've been big Poldark fans lately. It's like, oh man, can't wait for the next week. But anyway. All right. But that's what you do. That's what you do. I don't know what that had to do with this, but here we go. So these are, and this is the closest thing that I think that we'd have to, like maybe we celebrate Thanksgiving, you know, in the history of our own country, and the whole purpose behind getting together and celebrating getting the community together. And if it's true, they invited the Native Americans to sit around the same table and inviting people from the outside, all focusing on God's goodness in some way. So there might be something there. All right. What's also interesting about this, just let's look ahead really quick. This really gets crazy, but now let's turn to the book of Zechariah. And on another special day, the day of the Lord, and in the prophet's, the prophetic vision and future seeing that he has here, the prophet Zechariah is addressing a group of people who have had church for a while, who've come out of exile, who are now having, they've rebuilt their temple, and they're trying to grab onto their historic roots and properly applying the instruction and the teaching that they have from Moses on some of these convocations. And he encourages them with something that's pretty profound. Of course, we looked at this with regards to our bookend idea. And in chapter 14, verse 9, you see the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day, the Lord will be the only one, and His name the only one. So this focus on God and His name, His reputation, His role as king, as we've already seen, is a focus of one of the reasons of celebration when we have these convocations. That's verse 9 in chapter 14. Yeah, but I'm not done with that. Notice in verse 16. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations after the judgment, the battle, and all that stuff happens, when against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate what? The Feast of Booths. It's going to be part of the celebration on the day of the Lord. It's going to be part of our activity. We're going to continue to have these community events. That's one of the things that we'll be doing in heaven. The new earth, that new heaven, new earth. So that's an interesting thing. And notice there, though, it involves the nations. Also the nations around. The full extension, the fullness of the invitation to the watching world will be made and offered and responded to on the day of the Lord. So, there you go. It's a Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Booths is going to be around for a while. The principle of the Sabbath rest is also applied to the agricultural system and the economic system in Leviticus. Let's go back to Leviticus chapter 25. Chapter 25, verses 1 through 7. Let's have Let's see here. See, Dallas Smith? There you go. Why don't you read for us in chapter 25, verses 1 through 7.
The Lord then spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crop. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest after growth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. And the land shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath products, the land for food, yourself, and your male and female slaves, and your hired man, and foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you. Even your cattle and animals that are in your land shall have its crops. Shall have all its crops to eat."
So what's interesting about this is an application of the Sabbath principle, but on the land. And so rest is applied not just to people every 6 days in the 7th day of rest. Now we've got it applied in this yearly cycle to the land, and it's going to overlap and involve the not just the Israelites in the land, but it's going to involve the poor, the needy, the orphan, the widow, the helpless, the stranger, the alien, the non-Israelite. But this one's applied to the land. So after 6 years of harvest, farmers were to allow 1 full year of rest for the land. So crops would be stored up and shared among all who were participants in the household. So this brings in servants, slaves, foreign residents, and aliens living next door. And it involves the beasts of burden, those working animals that would be given that whole year off to renew and perhaps to have babies and do all that stuff. So the stuff they couldn't be doing if they were working all the time. So this is an interesting application. And I think it has also side benefits to just, maybe they knew this, maybe they knew it kind of from practice, but the full chemistry of what happens when you leave your land fallow for a year, we know more about now in terms of the aridability of the land, the nutrients, replenishing of the nutrients, how all of the microbes work to replenish nitrogen in the soil, and the agricultural value of having, insects at work so that the land's available to hold moisture much better, which prevents against famines. That's an antidote against famines and dry spells, which were inevitable in that arable part of the world. So all of this is important. But there's a spiritual benefit to applying rest with regards to our lives. And all of the cycles that we've seen bring together activity, the idea of feasting, the bringing in of offerings, but then rest. So there's the celebration and the focus on the Lord and His goodness, and then there's the rest. And it's not total inactivity, but it's work towards focusing on the Lord and His activity as God, as King. So that's important. Now we have also the economic cycles are also interrupted by this principle of rest. All those working in the land will rest and focus on the Lord, and they'll have time to focus on the things that really matter. So, the economic impact of this is interesting. I've got a guy in my Sunday school class who owns some Chick-fil-A's in the community in Mansfield and in South Arlington, and I think he owns 3. And he's very proud to tell you this. He says, even though we are closed one day out of the week, if you line up the cash flow and compare us to any of the restaurants around, it's amazing how much more Chick-fil-A's bring in terms of overall sales compared to any of the other restaurants around them, if you look at the dollars and cents of it. So the economic. So even though they're taking a year off, you think that the Lord has a way of blessing? He does. He does. And so that's what God is obligated to do behind the scenes as a means of following through with his end of the deal, so to speak. So there's something to be said there. And the land itself, we've talked about that. I'm not going to show you that video clip. It's just talking about some chemist comes on, some land expert, soil expert comes on and talks about what happens when you let land go fallow for a year. And it's interesting. You can watch that on your own. I want to make sure we get done here with Leviticus. So here's the Sabbath principle. And back in chapter 25, let's look at verses 8 through 13. And John, could you read verses 8 through 13?
Okay. You shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years. And the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. You shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee to you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of its own accord, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. For it is the jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall eat its produce from the field. In this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his possession.
One more verse.
And if you sell anything to your neighbor, or buy from your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another.
Okay. Well, this is a really radical principle, the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee is what it's called in verses 8 through 13. And you've got the cycle of 7 sabbatical years for the land. Then the horn sounded and the release is proclaimed for land and servants or slaves. A release of ownership with regards to the land or anything that's owned. So I'm trying to... the fullness of understanding this. So if you are in a situation where you are owing somebody money, let's say, one of the things that you could do as a right response to the situation is indenture yourself as a servant for the paying back of the money that is owed for a time, but not beyond the year. See, verses 8 through 13. Not beyond this time period. And in terms of the release, you would only be I'm having a hard time explaining this. You'd be released of your obligation as in that servant role after this time period. So there'd be this release of not only owing yourself in terms of paying back through the idea of being a servant, but also as it's applied to the land. If I'm land would be assigned to families, and if there was land that would be sold or leased, you might say, that land would be given back to its original owner after this period of 7 sabbatical, this period of this 49 year, then 50th cycle. So what would that do to the economy? That's really what I'm getting at. The implications of the economy would be Israel would not be an economy built on debt. Does that make sense? See how radical that would be. So you would have business practices. You'd be involved in legal transactions with all of this in view. So I'm not putting that person under the ball and chain of owing me something forever and ever. And it wouldn't be an economy built on the interest because of debt. That would not be the case in Israel. Does that make sense? You couldn't make money for very long on holding that over somebody's head, charging them interest, because after the period of 7 sevens or 49 to 50, they would be released. Or after 7 years, I'm sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. 7 sabbatical years, so they'd just be released back to the ownership. and nobody could be held in that perpetual state of owing anybody money. So this economy of debt, this economy that thrives on charging interest, would not be in existence, wouldn't be part of what God's perfect plan for the economy would be. That's a striking contrast to our current situation, is it not? I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. So, an economy propped up on debt and poverty. So that's not what Israel was supposed to be modeling. Now, the pagan world around was probably that way. In fact, we see that evidence, that there was a lot of taking advantage of people who owed somebody else money. And that's been alive and well in the history of humanity, I'm sure, just because of sin and selfishness and greed and all of those things. So, all right, we're getting near the end here. So where does this, let's see, where is this going to go as we look ahead in terms of what's next for Israel? Let's take a look at Leviticus chapter 26, and let's look at verses 31 through 35. And let's see here. Is Kelsey Taylor here? Yeah, why don't you read for us?
31 through 35?
Yes.
Okay. And I will lay your cities waste, and I will make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not smell your pleasing aromas. And I myself will devastate the land, so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled at it. And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword after you. And your land shall be desolation, and your city shall be a waste. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate while you are in your enemy's land. And the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall have rest, and the rest that it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were dwelling in it.
Okay. Well, there's a little bit of a context there. So what's going on here is with regards to what God will do in response to Israel as a nation if she is doing exactly what the pagan nations are about doing before that she gets there. So this idea of principle of the rest and the Sabbath day of rest applied to the land, applied to the economy, and all the facets through the convocations, that will be a repeated cycle. If these things aren't done, if this rest principle is violated in some way, which, remember, the principle of the Sabbath comes from the original 10 commandments, then God will drive Israel out of the land. If the people are violating this principle while they're on the land, the only way to allow the Sabbath principle, the fallowing of the land, to occur is to get Israel off. And then it happens. Then her fields will go unplowed and unharvested. So there's going to be some potential judgment wrapped up into what we'll see down the road with regards to actually exile does happen. And if we look at places like Jeremiah, let's take a look at Jeremiah. We'll just jump ahead a little bit. Verse 29, chapter 29. Jeremiah 29, verse 10. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare, not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. So this is the idea of 70 years in exile. What Jeremiah talks about is linked to rest for the land, you see. So it's interesting how this is going to have implications down the road for the exilic experience for Israel, because as a nation she eventually will abuse the principle of the Sabbath. And we'll see when we get to the prophets how active Israel had become in taking advantage of the poor and the needy. And you'll hear the prophet Amos screaming against Israel in the north, against the injustice that was prevalent in Israel. And you might say the opposite was happening in Israel. Israel's taking advantage of the poor and needy and was involved in dishonest gain in the city markets with regards to the scales and the weights. And all of these things are referenced by the prophets as a charge against Israel in anticipation of the what next, because the exile hadn't happened yet, but it was just around the corner. So it's interesting how the prophets pick up on this early teaching of Moses as they build their case against guilty Israel at the time just before the exile. So we'll look at that, and we'll make the connections down the road later. A good example of this, let's just turn to one prophet, the prophet Amos. Amos and Hosea are some of my favorites. But here we go. Amos chapter 8, verses 4 through 10. And this is an interesting charge from the prophet. And these prophets, what we have in the recorded messages, you almost hear them screaming off the page, in their charge. Hear this, you who trample the needy, to do away with the humble of the land, saying, quote, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, that we may open up the wheat market, that we may open up the Chick-fil-A, to make the bushel smaller and the shekel bigger, and to cheat with dishonest scales, so as to buy the helpless for money and the needy for a pair of sandals, and that we may sell the refuse of the wheat. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, indeed I will never forget any of their deeds. And he goes on, talk about the judgment. But you see all the references made there. Prophets are fully aware of Moses' teaching on some of these things with regards to injustice, causes for injustice and dishonesty, with regards to business practices. And here specifically, they don't want to practice the Sabbath. Why? It's they get an extra day during the week to be dishonest. That's why. One more day to make a profit and to take advantage of the poor and the needy. And Amos has some strong words against that, as we'll see. So that's just one example of how you make the connections. So the Lord says, look, if you're not going to practice my, Sabbath day of rest, and if you're not going to properly recognize this day of rest and providing for the needs of the poor and needy in your community, then I'm going to force my hand and make it happen. You're all going into exile. So, all right. We're almost done here. But this was all a means of magnifying the name and reputation of the Lord. What nation around in their right mind would take a full day off and close down their markets and not be out in the fields working? That's a radical nation. And all the nations around, again, would be watching and scratching their heads saying, how is it that they can be more blessed than us? How is it that their God or gods, we're not really sure. We think maybe they just worship one, as if one's enough. We worship all of these gods, and we're not experiencing the bounty for our crops and our agriculture system and our economic system like they are. See? It's kind of like a Daniel and his friends, not eating the meat of the of the king as a way, means of being faithful, but they end up being blessed tenfold down the road. So I think that's what we have a situation in this thriving economy that Israel was supposed to have, if properly applied, would be a benefit for all of the people of the community. Needs of the poor and the orphans and the widows would all be dealt with and taken care of. There would not be individuals forced into situations where they're having to serve to pay back debt or to make ends meet. You wouldn't have that kind of situation. So that would be a radical situation in the ancient world. So, and the nations were also, we talked about the Feast of Booths. Let's see. I've already talked about the Zechariah passage and the day of the Lord. So let's focus on the last slide here. I think the Feast of Booths is significant. We talked about it showing up again in the day of the Lord in Zechariah chapter 14. So I won't reiterate that. I kind of jumped ahead on that. So let's just move to the last slide. So this is the walking billboard idea. Kind of an old goofy picture, but when Israel walks around, what were we supposed to see? And that's kind of what I want you to have as the backdrop for a lot of the instruction that we see going on. Israel is being defined as a nation radically different than any of the pagan nations around her at the time. She was to be a walking billboard for Yahweh, which would have been on the primary billboard that she would be wearing, figuratively, of course. But every aspect of the community and horizontal relationships, how they would be eating, how they would be worshiping, how they would be dealing with children, the household structure, the economic system, the agricultural system, all of these aspects are changed because of the name of Yahweh. And I think that's an interesting walk away for our modern context. You know, we're not in a situation where the church is the dominant force, but how can we help our people apply this kind of mentality for those in our congregations who are who own their own business, to be encouraged to try some of these things out and take them out for a test drive? How could they be challenged to be radically different than the business owners around them, to be a Christian business? So there's some principles that we can think about as we work through the text. So that's all I have to say today. Be looking for this week a reading quiz. I think I spoke to some of you at break on, I'm going to combine Leviticus and Numbers into one quiz, but I won't make it too difficult. I'm going to make it really easy and fun and upbeat. So as a celebration of our midterm victory, I'll be grading the midterm this week, so you'll start to see your point totals showing up in Gradebook, in the Grade Center, in Blackboard. And there'll be a discussion forum question that'll come out of our lecture today. So we'll see you next week.
Yeah.